If possible, please update your screen name to match the name you registered under so that we can track attendance in order to send you links to the survey and the session recording. Feel free to add your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring and bringing forth your questions during our question and answer section. Couple more minutes to let people log on. I know it's lunchtime and sometimes it takes people a little bit to get to their desk. Hey, Rima, how are you?
A little hungry, but doing okay. It's lunchtime, right? But I had enough to tie myself over, and I'll just share for those who also are listening to my colleagues at New England Public Media. They're in pledge drive mode too, and we were talking about ice cream and pancakes. That's what got us through pitching this morning. So I hope you all have good something to eat to keep you going today.
Thanks, Rima. We're going to go ahead and get started with the session. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. Rima has over 25 years of experience working with nonprofit organizations in public media, arts, education, and the human service sector. She is currently the general manager at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut, having previously worked at New England Public Radio in Springfield, where we were colleagues. Rima was a founding faculty member in the Nonprofit Management and Philanthropy Master's Degree Program at Bay Path University. She continues to enjoy teaching online as an adjunct professor in the program. Rima is originally from the Philippines and spent her early years in several Southeast countries with her family, attending international schools. Living overseas exposed her to military coups that were foundational in developing her drive to work with mission-driven organizations that promote equity and social justice. Folks, we sure are privileged to have Rima as our presenter today.
Hello, all, and thank you so very much, Daisy, for having me. And it's nice to be amongst friends from the public radio system in Western Mass, as well as colleagues that I've worked with or had as students. And also a shout out to some of my colleagues here from WSHU Public Radio, as well as some of my board members. Now, this might seem like a weighty topic, but we are not going to be weighty about this. This is a joyful topic. I love talking about philanthropy, and in talking about the philanthropy that we are going to talk about today with the intersectionality around nonprofit culture and structural racism, this is going to be a joyful conversation. And Bianca, let's go ahead and get started. Great. So go right ahead and forward to the next slide, Bianca. Thank you. So again, intersectionality between philanthropy, nonprofit culture, and structural racism. This is not going to be a weighty conversation, an important conversation, but it'll definitely be a joyful one. Go ahead and move forward, Bianca. Thank you. So why do donors give? That's really where I want to start this conversation. The reason why donors give is because they have resources to donate to organizations, because organizations, meaning nonprofit organizations that are mission-based, meet needs. This is different from actually organization having needs. So you might have a busted boiler in your organization, but it's not because you have a busted boiler that donors give to you. It's because that busted boiler, once fixed, provides warmth, and then you possibly provide cots to women and children as a homeless shelter. And that's why donors give to you, because you provide shelter to the homeless not because you have a busted boiler. Next slide. So I want to make sure that we also talk about organizations that are mission-based meeting needs. And this is really how we want to shift the conversation just solely around donor needs to actually donors meeting the needs of the communities through organization. Think about employing trust-based philanthropy, that you trust the organization that you're giving funds to meet the needs of the community. And it's those organizations that have the expertise to do so. And donors should really think about partnering with the communities through the organizations that have the expertise, such as the Community Foundation of Western Mass. Next slide, please. Let's go back to Democracy in America, Philanthropic Roots. Like, you might have read this or might not have read this in college. This really is where we encounter, we being modern US, encounters the modern philanthropy. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville does not use actually the term philanthropy. He talks, though, about what's different in the United States from European countries is that our inhabitants, because this is not citizenship yet, our inhabitants gather together and form associations, and we tackle the problems in our communities. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, go back one more slide. Sorry, Bianca. So again, in Democracy in America, while de Tocqueville does not use the term philanthropy, he really talks about this forming of associations. And that's so very different than what was happening in the UK and in France at that time, because all of these safety nets that are provided in communities, yes, they're provided by the church, but they're provided by governments. And so this is where the term also non-governmental organization and nonprofit organization comes from, because these nonprofit entities are not tied into making profit, or they're not tied into governments to address the social issues. Now, what we really have to also take into account is who gets to be part of these associations that Alexis de Tocqueville is talking about, right? And clearly it is not the indigenous folks that welcomed the pilgrims to their table for Thanksgiving. Clearly it is not our African-American citizens that weren't even citizens at this time, but it wasn't the slaves and it wasn't the indigenous folks that were currently here in this country before Columbus supposedly founded our country. Next, please. So let's put a pause on looking at what de Tocqueville talked about, and really also look more at the roots of volunteerism in this country. As we saw with what de Tocqueville said, that we put together associations. These were associations that became a lot of our volunteer associations in our country. And that what's important about what volunteerism in the US, different from anywhere else in the world that was captured at this time, is that we banded together with like-minded individuals to take action to either react to an issue that showed up in our communities and then broadly in our countries, or knowing that something can happen, we are also proactive in our approach. And again, this is all just documented philanthropic roots of just the nonprofit sector. And so the big takeaway from all of this is also that the nonprofit sector existed long before our formal governments existed for the United States of America. Next, please. This is my absolute favorite quote. And I should also just quick tangent to let you know, The slide deck that you're seeing now will be sent to you at the end of this presentation. And I've set up my slides as they are to for you to understand, and you don't have to take notes. So there are full sentences and ideas in each of these slides. So now my favorite Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote: "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which philanthropy makes necessary." There's a lot packed into that quote, and there are a lot of important ideas into how philanthropy has been set up in the United States to be a safety net, but then understanding, as Martin Luther King Jr. did, about the economic injustices that exist that causes philanthropy and the philanthropists to put the Band-Aid really on solving some of the economic injustices in our country with philanthropic gifts. Next slide. So another thread that I wanted to introduce was just who we are and where we are with demographics in our country. Already, children under the age of 18 are in what has been termed a majority minority. Another phrase that's been taking root among many folks of color is talking about the global minority, or the global majority rather, because globally, folks of color make up the majority. Specifically within the United States, as we see here from the Brookings Institute study, by 2045, we will flip from folks of color being in the majority. And note that also multiracial individuals who identify for more than one race, it is increasing, and that increases especially in our kids cohort, those age 18 and under. Note also that the most recent immigrants to the United States are from Asian countries, even though that the majority of our current foreign-born residents are of Hispanic origin. Next slide, please. Here are the cases for diversity and inclusion and equity from the moral, economic, market case, and a results case perspective. Next slide, please. But it's internalizing those cases that I just presented on the other slide is what really matters for your organization. Here's what we know, that diverse perspectives in decision-making will lead to better decisions. A diverse staff and board can help legitimize a mandate of an organization in a community. A diverse staff and board can help build social capital and cohesion amongst a diverse population. And this is the important one in terms of philanthropy. A diverse staff and board can help fundraise much more effectively. Next slide, please. So early in not early, I'd say mid to late 90s and early 2000s, there was the shift from going from being what was termed multicultural to becoming culturally competent. And this is a way to think about being culturally competent from that time frame. But we've then also moved forward into the mid 2000s and in that first decade of the 2000s to thinking about being more than just culturally competent. And that's our next slide. We talk about cultural humility, which really is about a more humble and respectful attitude towards looking at individuals and other cultures and challenging our own cultural biases. Realization is really about that one can't possibly know everything that you could know about a person or a culture, so that approaching learning about someone else's culture is really from this humility-based practice. Next slide. Okay, so we've established certain threads, right? We have the thread about volunteerism. We have the thread about philanthropic roots and where the nonprofit sector emerged from, we are looking at the diversity of our demographics as a country currently and moving towards 2045. And then we're also looking at why diversity, equity, and inclusion are good and necessary values in our organization. So what is the problem with all of this? Well, here's the answer. Nonprofit culture can absolutely be alienating, and it can other those it serves. So the fact that we have this nonprofit culture that exists within our organizations that are trying to serve the people at the heart of our communities, but we're othering them, we need to be extremely aware of that. Next slide, please. Mission and value statements often contain what we call deficit framing language. We help at-risk youth in high crime neighborhoods. We help low resources communities achieve better equity. And that is a stigmatizing way to talk about the people that you are trying to serve. Instead, what I am recommending for us to consider is to look at asset framing. So instead of trying to say that we're helping at-risk youth in high crime neighborhoods, we're saying we help people overcome obstacles to achieve their dreams, right? So the focus is not at-risk youth, but it's about helping these young people achieve their dreams. Next slide, please. So asset framing is a narrative that defines people by their assets and aspirations before noting the challenges and deficits. And can we play the little clip, please?
Framing is about not defining people by their challenge, right? So once you recognize that I aspire to be a scientist or a leader, or maybe I just aspire to graduate high school. Like I have a goal to be a student, right? Whatever that aspiration is, if you acknowledge that aspiration before you go into my various challenges, you're telling a truer story about me, right? I don't run around believing I'm an at-risk this or a low-income that or a high poverty, high crime. Like no one carries around those labels thinking that's how I'm gonna face the world, right? What people think about is, I want to maybe go to school. I want to maybe someday own a home. I want to maybe possibly get out of this neighborhood or come back to this neighborhood and build. Whatever that person's aspiration is, if you haven't bothered to acknowledge that aspiration before you engage them, then you've made them an object in the sentence. They are a thing to be dealt with, to be moved, to be manipulated. They are not a person. And once you start to engage people as obstacles, once you start engaging people as problems, then recognize that you've now become the problem, right?
So why this is really important from a donor's perspective is that the mission you are trying to meet and serve shouldn't objectify and stigmatize
one of the damning things
individuals.
About narrative is whatever you repeat to people that doesn't get addressed, they absorb. So you will have people repeating.
Sorry for the technical glitch. So again, bringing this back to why this is important to the donor. Donors are trying to help the people achieve their dreams and their goals in their community. By using the deficit framing method instead of an asset framing method, as we've just heard, you are objectifying and stigmatizing the very people that you are trying to help, and they are literally just an object. And that it sets also up this hero notion that donors are going to come in and save all of these folks. And instead of partnering with human beings in an actual community. Next slide, please. So the difficulty with how the donor-centric model has come about and what it's really done for just the entire continuum of philanthropy is that it emphasizes crisis. So it sets up then the people who you're trying to help and the communities you're trying to help as the villains in this narrative, because it's the donors are being set up as the good guys, and then those in the community are being set up then as the bad guys. And that is not the intent of a donor-centric model, but because of how the donor-centric model ties in with structural racism, this is actually what the donor-centric model is perpetuating. It's perpetuating the structural racism that already exists in our country. Next slide, please. And so just repeating what you've already heard, defining people by their challenges is the definition of stigmatizing them. And so this is the language that we are trying to take away, right? And what are the outcomes if we don't make this change to asset framing for our missions and our visions in our organizations, right? The white savior complex, that it's only certain people who can come in and save certain communities. Here's something that's very important. How we're talking about and who we include in conversations around philanthropy. Right now, philanthropists of color and communities are not centered as part of the mainstream on how we're talking about not just philanthropy, but continuing to talk about community assets that can be used to solve the issues that many of our communities face. So unwittingly, some of them unwittingly and some of them wittingly, nonprofits and funders perpetuate this stigmatization around how mission and visions of nonprofit organizations currently stand. Next slide, please. So reframing our missions to be mission-centered instead of donor-centered, and that's where we started this. So making the missions of our organizations and talking to our donors about having them meet the missions of their organizations through the expertise that the organizations have is the way to really make sure that we engage in trust-based philanthropy and mission-based philanthropy instead of making it donor-centered. And this way, we are also helping reframe our missions in an asset framing perspective instead of a deficit framing perspective. Next slide, please. And so let's just see a video on asset framing in practice.
You are not a proficient reader. You have been told many, many, many times, possibly every day of your educational life, what you're not good at. They're pretty good, by the way. 9th and 10th graders are great at listing their deficits to you. I don't want to give them any more ammunition in that effort. And I think if kids are sitting in a class where they feel like there's something broken in me or there's some aspect of failure in me, the likelihood that they're going to be brave in that ambiguous space is none. They have no reason to be brave. They've been told that they shouldn't be somehow. And a deficit mindset is a great way to teach a kid too, not to try anything outlandish or creative or new.
What does it mean when you get yelled at home or something bad happens and then you come to school in that space? What do you think that does to your learning?
It interferes with it.
It affects it? Is it your fault that it affects it?
No.
No, it's not.
I have a student, Daniel, who is tremendously courageous. He's a young, tall, mixed race young man that already comes with a package of beliefs and biases and all the things. He has a very strong sense of his own boundaries, which I believe is a huge asset for him. But if you are a person like a teacher or an administrator who is looking for acquiescence and immediate smiling compliance, you may see that as noncompliance or disrespect or something like that, whereas that could not be farther from the truth. But on top of that, it can talk to almost anyone at any level, at any time. And it's mostly because he has this fantastic way of not judging people, and he can just like be receptive to conversation. And so using that strength and like calling his attention to that strength, I said, "You have this strength." And then he's like, "Yeah." And I said, "But you know that?" And he goes, "That's because you tell me every day."
I'm Daniel Boyd II. I'm named after my dad. I want to eventually be a lawyer. That's my favorite teacher, Ms. Daniel. Like whenever I'm down, she was always the first one to bring me up and lift me.
It's very important to him to feel an emotional connection to his teachers and administrators. He has to trust you before he's going to do his best work. Because, and this is where the deficit mindset definitely came in, I believe, is that he was very timid to try new things and to really stretch himself to that rigorous level that where he'd have to think in ways that he wasn't used to thinking.
She's the type of teacher is like, she comes and she'll talk to you, and like even if she knows you understand it, she'll still come to you and make sure 100% that you understand, and so she understands that you understand. It's more relaxed and calm, and I find it way more understanding than any other class would be.
My dad used to say, if you ever want something out of a child, accuse them of it first. And I live my whole teaching career this way. So as soon as I see sort of a nugget of brilliance in them, they get accused of it a lot. And it's reiterated a lot. The minute you say, what's that student's deficit, I immediately think of numbers and data. But that has nothing to do with him as a human being or what he brings to my classroom, the value that he bestows on any group that he's a part of. How you want to frame your own thoughts in your head have a lot to do with how much you get out of a student or how a student feels about you. So I can't control a lot of things, but what I can control is what I'm thinking about a student. I know that student's a great leader, or I know that student's a great listener. It's like I know that he's going to listen to me, and I know that she's going to be able to draw, and I know that he's going to be able to write all the text out. There's no student in my class that's not accused of something really exceptional. But I would say that's probably my most fun way of using a strengths mindset, and it's probably one of the ways that the kids respond to best. And it's always really sad when one of them will say, "No one's ever told me that," or and you're like, I just want you to hear every single day that you do these amazing things and bring all this value to the space that you're in. Anyway, it's the fun part of my job.
Thanks. One of the things that I love best about that short video is noting how the teacher interacts with the students to work with them to define what their needs are. And that's something that we can take away as donors and organizations to work with communities, to really understand that we need to partner with our communities to come up with solutions that work for the communities. The deficit framing specifically for the student Daniel, who was featured in that video, could very well be low-income student of color, needs to better engage with school, so that's why we need support. Well, another way to frame that from the asset framing perspective is we want to encourage leaders like Daniel to engage deeper with their teachers and the school's curriculum to achieve their career aspirations. But again, note that what's really important for donors to take away is that you work with the communities that you're serving through the organizations. And that's what I love very much about the video that we just saw from the teacher. And I also call a lot of this reframing kind of parent management. If you are a parent with young kids, or kids of any age, one of the things we really know is that talking to your kids from a positive perspective tends to lead to positive outcomes, which is very different than, parenting by fear or parenting from a perspective that isn't positive. So I'd like to look at the last video. And this Alexandra Bell is a phenomenal journalist and artist, and her art project around Counternarratives really talks about what happens when we don't use asset framing. And this is just our current reality. So this is what we want to change, and she's working hard to change that.
Alexandra Bell is, she can't be with us here today, but she offered to show this video, which was produced by the ICP, so thank you for allowing us to share this video. So Alexandra Bell is an artist who consistently challenges problematic representations. She's a multidisciplinary artist who investigates the complexities of narrative, information consumption, and perception. Utilizing various media, she deconstructs language and imagery to explore the tension between marginal experiences and dominant histories. Through investigative research, she considers the ways media frameworks construct memory and inform discursive practices around race, politics, and culture. And she's a wonderful artist, and this video kind of is a wonderful way to introduce you to her work for those of you all that are not familiar.
I think everything's about race. Black communities, gay communities, immigrant communities feel a lot of media representations to be inadequate, biased. There's a lot of reporting around police violence and Black men. And I realized a lot of the arguments that we were having were about depictions. I started to wonder, how different would it be if I swapped images or if I changed some of the text? And so that was the first time I physically started playing around with the works. This isn't a grammar exercise. I'm really trying to see if I can disrupt subliminal messaging about who should be valued. I needed kind of one of the most respected institutions that kind of prides itself on getting this right to kind of say, actually, nope, you're not getting it right, right? The Counternarrative series, the primary way you see it is in public, on the streets. We went to 4 locations between Bedside and Crown Heights area and hung them up. You imagine who might be moving in at like the height of gentrification in many of these neighborhoods. And you're putting this print up of this like dead Black kid. The title is 2 Lives at the Crossroads, equating these 2 lives as if they're neighbors. The Times layout to me perpetuated that. The subtlety there is that this isn't equal. These people are on equal footing. They have equal responsibility in this event that took place, and that's not true. I don't believe that. You have a cop and you have a kid, and there's a responsibility here, and it lies with one person more than the other. I know he was 18. I feel like if he wasn't Black, we would be calling him a kid. So there's a lot of what in journalism is key information. He'd sometimes use drugs and he'd rapped, and I just don't think that that's necessary information. So I blacked it out. Like, oh, that's what you do when you're 18. You do drugs, and you drink, and you rap, and you curse. Because, like, really, did you just write in here that you curse? It just goes to show how important images are. It changed the way I viewed the text. Now you know he's a kid, right? During the Olympics and the Ryan Lochte scandal, you have this headline about these swimmers, and then there's this big photo of Usain Bolt. And I remember just being like, what the hell? There's no way if the track team had done that, they wouldn't have been on the front page. People felt like I caught the Times making a mistake. And maybe willfully using the image of a Black man under crime. I found a very good image of Ryan Lochte. That was just him alone in the pool. I redacted most of the article, but I also inserted white Americans into the title to categorize it in a way that other races were categorized. I guess there's something restorative about it, kind of restorative justice. You know, online, the hashtag was like white crime, white photo. And that was really funny because people were like, yeah, that's actually a really good hashtag.
When you are done with the stand, move back. When you are done.
I'm 35, I've never seen a torch rally. Like, this is some shit I feel like I would read about in a book. It was a riot by white nationalists, and I was like, they're gonna get it wrong. And they got it so wrong. It was a side piece. It had 2 columns out of the 5 on the front page that day. If you have a white torch rally, this is a major event. This isn't a sidebar item. For the most part, I keep the layouts how they are, but the problem here was the layout, right? That's the journalistic hiccup here, is that this layout doesn't speak to the severity of these issues. What you give space to and what you allow people to see says a lot. The Tulsa hate crime is a really interesting one because I didn't really make an image swap. Vernon Majors was this white guy. He lives next to this Lebanese family, and he had harassed them for years. And eventually, and unfortunately, he kills the son, Khalid Jabara. It runs with this wonky headline that says he's a Tulsa man and accused of harassing this Lebanese family, charged with murder. Huh, that's interesting. The Lebanese family had been there for 30-something odd years. I say since '83. And this guy had been there like 7 years. So I'm trying to figure out why he would get that title. If anybody was to get it, it's Jabara who should get that title. And I removed Lebanese. And I also inserted white American. I was really interested in the way the news can slightly other people. And I used the word racism as well. Because he called the family dirty Arabs, but then it just says harassing. And I'm like, I don't understand why we can't just say racism. Like, they just didn't want to use the word racism. The news cycle moves so quickly that we're all kind of skimming through things and we're just kind of accepting narratives. It's not always this bombastic and in your face. There are these subtle ways that racism works in the oldest of institutions. If it's not this egregious thing coming at you, I think it's so easy to ingest. You might not print Mexicans or rapists. What other ways do you contribute to the thinking about minorities? You have to be able to look in the mirror and go, we're failing in these ways. And if you don't see yourself as maybe just as much of a problem in some ways as Trump, then what work are you doing? What's important about Counternarratives is that it's not meant to be like an indictment of news media. I could almost say that it's just as much as an indictment of the reader. Now, I don't know what impact that will have with the papers, but I definitely know people are saying to me, when I'm reading now, I'm saying to myself, why is this photo here? There's something about seeing a different image, about shifting the size of a photo. It gets at a feeling that people have, but they don't know how to explain it. Where I'm situated as a person in the margins, I think I can see where there are gaps in ways that other people may not. I'm a Black gay woman. That goes very much into kind of how I see the news, how I interpret what happens. What I believe might be an angle that's overlooked doesn't necessarily mean I'm more right. It just means I have a different vantage point.
So the call to action of what Alexandra Bell is asking of us is, what ways are we contributing to thinking about minorities, about folks of color, about communities of color? And thinking about that, plus the takeaway that I want you all to have from this conversation is that the intersection of structural racism, nonprofit culture, and the donor-centric mindset have led to stigmatizing the very people we are trying very hard to help. And we are alienating them. We are making them an other. They are simply an object in the missions of our organizations. And it's time to reframe around an asset framing mindset instead of this deficit framing mindset. And I think, Alexandra Bell's work really starkly shows that words and images matter. As donors concerned about helping our communities grow and flourish and wanting to involve all people in what we want to do, we must absolutely rethink how we are framing our missions and visions to not demonize the people we are trying to serve, which is what happens through this deficit framing instead of the asset framing model. Thanks, Bianca, for doing the slides. Daisy, I would love to open it up to questions and comments from folks.
Thank you, Rima, for that presentation. I have a couple of questions for you. One of our participants asked, it seems to me that asset reframing is in part about increased efforts to connect communities. Can you, Rima, comment on whether this is a tactic we can utilize, and if so, any best practices on how to do so?
Yes, not only is it about connecting communities, but it's also connecting with the key stakeholders within a community, right? So making sure that whether it's you as a donor or you as an organization are involving the right people in a community to solve those community issues. So that right now within the deficit framework, communities or folks in a community that you're trying to help are usually relegated to the sideline, right? And what we need to do is make sure we are working with people, especially in Western Mass, in the communities of Granby, in Springfield, in Chicopee, and especially rural communities up, within the Franklin County and the Berkshire County area, working with them to address the problems, because there's a lot of knowledge that rests in those communities that can help solve the community problems. And so that's the best way to connect not just communities to each other, but to connect donors and organizations with the key stakeholders within the community. Does that make sense, Daisy?
It does. Nothing for us without us.
Absolutely.
Next question. Have you encountered pushback from donors when moving away from donor-centric language?
Yes, is the short answer. And, there are really difficult conversations because the notion of the hard work a donor has done in terms of helping communities, that donor wants to be recognized for the knowledge that they have in helping those communities from their perspective, and the knowledge from their perspective about all of the years that they've donated. This is, as Daisy, as the title of this conversation has talked about, it's about shifting the mindset, right? It's not about the donor that's helping. It's about the communities that are being helped. And there are absolutely indeed some people that are very upset that it's no longer about them. I'm part of the Gen X generation, and my husband and I giggle when we watch TV that we are now the absolute target audience of a lot of the AARP, ads, and we are the target of a lot of new programs and shows. There was a long time that we weren't the target audience. And so clearly, society is shifting. And I use that just as a small example that there are donors that are really upset and are pushing back that why isn't it about them anymore? And what I frame for those donors is we are at a time historically in our country where those folks, the communities of color and indigenous communities are in a place where they're taking back their narratives and they're structuring the narratives to include them at the center where they haven't been at the center for a long time.
Thank you. We have another comment. One of our participants heard a lot about this framework for nonprofits to shift. Can you share some suggestions specifically for donors on how we should act differently when looking at our philanthropic endeavors?
I would ask the organization in terms of what work is being done to shift away from this donor-centric mindset and do a lot of listening. I mean, that's one of the things too that I loved from the teacher asset framing video was that you saw the teacher listening to her students about what their needs were. This is a time for donors, especially white donors of means and wealth, to listen. One of the things that we also need to think about as organizations and donors is to reframe how we define wealth screening, for example, and who are our donors that are engaged with us and that are given priorities in an organization. One of the things that we know in philanthropic research is folks with lower means, poor people give more out of their income and what assets they have, if they have any assets, than the equivalent of what rich people do. And if we do that shift in our thinking and we do that shift in our mindset, that's where a donor can start. It's not about the donor anymore around donor-centric philanthropy. It's about the mission of the organization and the communities that they serve. They should always be at the center of who we are and what we do, because this is why this is the reason for nonprofit organizations to exist.
And if I may offer some suggestions as well, I think that it's important for donors, as Rima said, to listen, to partner. There is a power sharing that needs to take place. There needs to be less restrictions. Allow nonprofits and those implementing the work to be the experts and lead you on the journey of what is needed and how the money would be best utilized. And think about less reporting. Make it less cumbersome to fulfill the mission that we as philanthropists want to achieve. Rima, any other ideas?
Yes. So when I was a first-time parent, everyone, and we adopted my son, everyone rushed to help us out, me and my husband. And where the tension was, everyone assumed at what kind of help we needed as a new parent. No one ever bothered to ask, how can I help? What's the best way to help? And I share this story and I end with this story because that's the shift in mindset I would like donors to really take away from and nonprofit organizations to take away from. Ask communities and ask the people you want to help, how can we best help you? How can we work with you? Because, my mother-in-law just kept on sending clothes. We didn't need clothes. what we needed. And, you know, God bless my mother-in-law, and we have a lovely relationship. I said, what we really need is for you to come and actually take the baby so my husband and I can sleep, right? And again, I tend to use parenting metaphors because that's, you know, a shared humanizing factor for all of us, regardless of income, regardless of station in life, regardless of ethnicity and race. Ask how you can help. And then using this asset framing framework is, I think, transformational. It sounds so simple, but it is indeed transformational.
Rima, I have one last excellent question.
Awesome.
And it says, how can we reframe philanthropy to address the root cause of institutional and structural isms? Overwhelmingly influential white men who often are absent when these matters are discussed.
We need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it with white men, and we can't shy away from the discussions. This is one of the reasons why I'm grateful to the Community Foundation, to Katie Allen Zobel and Daisy Pereira Tosado of inviting me today. This is a start of a conversation. I'm also sharing my slide deck widely with folks just so we can start having these conversations. And the hard part about it is having difficult conversations because people will shut you down. And seeking allies, especially white women allies, to have these conversations with white men is very important. And that's the only way we can start breaking down some of the isms that were perpetuated primarily by a white patriarchy. And they were the associations that were founded to perpetuate a lot of how our country was founded, how our country was built, and how philanthropy still continues today.
And if I may add, the other piece of this is sharing the definition, the anointing of the title philanthropy to all of our community members.
Absolutely.
And if we share it with our BIPOC community, who are very active in their own philanthropic endeavors, we then have a much more diverse pool to pull from and to have more robust conversations about this. So it will catch up, and those perpetuating the isms will have nowhere to run, because we philanthropists in the shared environment will always be there to hold folks accountable. Rima, thank you so much for presenting today. This was really lovely. I want to thank everyone for coming. I know that we are spending way too much screen time these days, so really a heartfelt thank you. If there are any further questions, you can send them over my way and we'll make sure to respond to you.
Daisy, I've also put into the chat my email address, and happy to continue this conversation with the folks who want to email me directly as well.
Perfect. And stay tuned on our website for the next learning opportunity. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good afternoon.